On September 11, 2001, the United States was attacked. In the span of an hour, 2 planes hit the World Trade Center, and another hit the Pentagon. The name on everyone's lips was Osama bin Laden, the Al-Qaeda leader. CIA analysts, FBI agents, and military planners all focused their crosshairs on him. Meanwhile, the real mastermind behind 9/11 lurked in the shadows, completely undetected, free to continue fulfilling his dreams of death and destruction. For years before September 11th, the US government had been given numerous opportunities to stop him, but each time they failed to put the pieces of the puzzle together before he slipped away. As a result, this man was able to orchestrate the most devastating attack on American soil since Pearl Harbor, killing almost 3,000 people. How did intelligence agencies let this happen? And how many more thousands of innocent lives would be taken before the identity of the world's most dangerous terrorist was finally uncovered? The research for this video was gathered primarily from the book The Hunt for KSM by LA Times journalists Terry McDermott and Josh Mayer, which was written with the help of hundreds of interviews, including FBI agents, CIA officers, jihadists, and family members, as well as official documents like court transcripts, memos, and reports. We also gathered our information from other credible sources, which can all be seen in the description below. By the way, sorry if my voice sounds a little weird today, folks. I'm feeling a bit under the weather. Anyways, the Strategic Information and Operations Center at FBI headquarters, or SIOC for short, was the Bureau's crown jewel. 40,000 square feet of gleaming white corridors, secure video conference rooms, and command centers designed to handle national emergencies, but nothing could have prepared them for this. Dale Watson, the FBI's Assistant Director for Counterterrorism, was in the command center conducting a briefing when the first plane hit the North Tower of the World Trade Center. By the time of the second impact, targeting the South Tower, any doubt that this was a deliberate act was gone. Every screen in SIOC was tuned to the horror unfolding in New York City. FBI Director Robert Mueller had been on the job for a little over 1 week. As agents scrambled to coordinate with local law enforcement, the CIA, and military command centers worldwide, one thing became crystal clear. The Bureau had somehow been caught entirely off guard. For months before the attacks, intelligence analysts had been tracking references to a mysterious figure known only as Mukhtar, Arabic for the Chosen One. The name had appeared in intercepts about sending sleeper agents to America, raising red flags but offering no clear leads about who exactly Mukhtar was. After the attacks, bin Laden publicly praised Mukhtar as the mastermind, which meant he was important. How he was tied to bin Laden and the attacks, what he still had planned, and all of it was a shadow in the fog. Missing key intelligence at the time like this was dangerous, so finding him was critical. In less than a month, the US invaded Afghanistan. With allies like the United Kingdom and Canada by their side, and aided by Afghanistan's Northern Alliance and Pashtun leaders in the south, American forces swept across the country with shocking speed. The Taliban government crumbled, and US forces overwhelmed Al-Qaeda's training camps. It was a stunning military victory for the US and its allies, but the big fish they were hunting, Osama bin Laden, Ayman al-Zawahiri, and other senior leadership had vanished. On October 10, 2001, President George W. Bush unveiled the FBI's first most wanted terrorist list, a bounty list featuring 22 of the most dangerous terrorists in the world. At the top of the list, unsurprisingly, was Osama bin Laden, wanted with a $25 million reward. But it would take another few months before the first major breakthrough. It was March 2002, and CIA officer John Kiriakou, a fluent Arabic speaker with a history of chasing terrorists around the globe, had been itching to get at the people responsible for 9/11, even threatening to resign if not immediately deployed. So when an assignment in Pakistan opened up, he jumped at it. Kiriakou and analyst Deuce Martinez were dispatched to the Pakistani city of Faisalabad, the home base of almost every significant jihadi group in the country. For the following weeks, he and Martinez tracked electronic signals across Punjab province using a piece of CIA hardware called the Magic Box. The device would send out an electronic signal keyed to a particular phone. If that phone were in range, it would send a ping back to the box. They were hunting Abu Zubaydah, a Palestinian known to have close ties to Al-Qaeda's inner circle of leadership. The intelligence community was unsure of the role Zubaydah held. Their assessments had changed multiple times over the past decade, but they knew that he was a key figure, and if anyone knew Al-Qaeda's secrets, it would be him. Above all, he would know the answer to the most critical question: where and when the next attack was going to be. The NSA had already collected the electronic signature of Zubaydah's phone, giving the CIA something to search for. They drove around the cities of Lahore and Faisalabad with the magic box every day, waiting for the ping. But Zubaydah was never in the same place twice. The CIA compiled their information, NSA signals, ground intelligence, emails, everything, and narrowed it down to 14 possible locations, 10 in Faisalabad and 4 in Lahore. But they knew that raiding each location one by one would end up being a pointless game of whack-a-mole. They needed to do something more risky and dramatic. Kiriaku's boss, the CIA Islamabad station chief, had a plan to hit all 14 sites simultaneously. 36 American agents from both the CIA and the FBI were paired with Pakistani forces, but the odds were stacked against them, tipping more towards chaos and failure than success. If Zubaydah escaped, or worse, was killed, they would be right back to square one. On March 28th, recon teams first scouted all 14 sites, looking for any sign of their target and any weakness they could exploit. Most of the sites were mud huts, but one house in an upper-middle-class Faisalabad neighborhood caught their eye. It was an unoccupied lot with a telephone wire that was split, with an illegal line to the peach-colored 3-story house next door. They believed they had their man, but they had to be sure. The next morning, at 2 a.m., the teams launched their 14 attacks. At the suspicious peach-colored house, the Pakistan Rangers had no sense of subtlety, ramming through the outer gate and ground floor doors. Kiriaku and the other FBI and CIA agents waited in a command post at a safe house in the middle of Faisalabad. Before a single radio transmission came through, they heard gunfire. It came from the direction of the house with the stolen phone line. The agents had to get there fast. They wanted Zubaydah taken alive. What they found when they arrived were the remnants of a brief but vicious gunfight. 3 men had tried to escape by jumping to a neighboring roof. One was killed instantly. A second died from his wounds, and the third, wounded in the groin, abdomen, and thigh, was bleeding out fast. John Kiriaku wasn't certain, but the wounded man seemed to match Zubaydah's image. An official observing from afar advised him to take a photo of the man's ear, the configuration of which is unique to every individual. When Islamabad got the image in an email, they ID'd it as probably belonging to their target. While the US was ready to take him in, one of the Pakistani officers was still hungry for vengeance. The carnage of the raid had left one of his own men wounded. He raised his weapon and offered to execute Zubaydah on the spot, but Kiriaku was clear and uncompromising. They had to deliver him alive. American agents finally took Abu Zubaydah, one of Al-Qaeda's most important operatives, as well as 10 of his associates, into custody. Zubaydah's wounds were severe enough to worry the CIA. They rushed him to a military hospital in Lahore to stabilize him before flying him out of Pakistan on a CIA Gulfstream in the middle of the night. The US military knew it had achieved another victory, but what the Americans didn't realize yet was that they had also captured the key to solving a mystery they only heard about in whispers. The jet landed at Thailand's Udon Royal Thai Air Force Base, a jungle facility that had served as the CIA's Air America headquarters during the Vietnam War. A hastily improvised interrogation center awaited, one of the first black sites in what would become a controversial global network of secret prisons. Zubaydah's interrogation was critical. While nobody knew his exact role in Al-Qaeda, his proximity to leadership meant he should be privy to a great deal of information. The FBI needed to select the right people to lead the questioning. They settled on 2. Ali Soufan was a brash young agent and one of the Bureau's few native Arabic speakers, while Stefan Godin was a former Army paratrooper who had recently helped crack the USS Cole bombing case. Both were veterans of the New York Joint Terrorism Task Force, but they weren't really in charge. The CIA told the FBI agents that they would play second fiddle to the CIA's interrogators. President Bush had made a vow that the CIA would take the lead on fighting Al-Qaeda, giving them authority. Unfortunately, they lacked the resources to conduct the questioning. The CIA hadn't even dispatched the interrogation team when Zubaydah was due to arrive. In fact, the higher-ups at the CIA weren't even convinced that they had Zubaydah in custody. Given the 14-site raid and the ensuing chaos, as well as the failure to capture any other notable Al-Qaeda leaders, they were skeptical. They needed clear corroboration from the FBI before they even considered sending their men. But Zubaydah's condition was dire. He was stable but barely alive, leaving little time to get the confirmation the CIA needed. The CIA officer in charge turned to FBI agents Soufan and Godin with grave news. "You 2 guys are it. There's nobody else here to do the interview." What followed was a masterclass in FBI interrogation technique. The FBI's approach to interrogations is built around accomplishing 2 key objectives: convincing the subject that the agents genuinely care for them and that the agents already know the answers to the most important questions. It was a technique that had served the Bureau well up until this point. Soufan and Godin used their encyclopedic knowledge of Al-Qaeda to test Zubaydah, working for days to build rapport around their wounded prisoner. His condition made that difficult. At times, he would suddenly slip away, forcing doctors to rush in and resuscitate him. Sticking to the FBI's rapport playbook, Soufan would hold ice cubes to Zubaydah's lips and murmur to him in Arabic, assuring him that these doctors would take care of him. That approach earned enough trust that Zubaydah willingly cooperated. To test his reliability, the agent showed him photographs on Godin's handheld computer, a crude little HP Jornada loaded with FBI wanted posters of every suspected Al-Qaeda operative. They were looking for two specific Al-Qaeda operatives, believed to be behind the 1998 African embassy bombings, Saif al-Adel and Abdullah Ahmed Abdullah. But the first photo Godin showed was a total mistake. He had accidentally called up the wrong wanted poster of a stocky, bearded man with glasses. That man was Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, or KSM for short, known only to investigators as the uncle of Ramzi Youssef, a 1994 World Trade Center bomber. For years, they had dismissed KSM as a second-tier freelancer. But Zubaydah suddenly squeezed Godin's arm. Godin was agitated by the reaction, believing that Zubaydah was claiming this guy was Abdullah and wasting their time. After days of resuscitating and caring for Zubaydah, Soufan told him clearly not to lie to them. "I know exactly who this is. This is Ramzi's uncle. The plot against the Pope, the plot against the Philippine airline. I don't want to talk about him. He's not important to me." But Zubaydah interrupted, still caught up on the photo. "How did you know about Mukhtar?" That one question hung in the air of the cramped medical facility in Thailand. Mukhtar, the phantom name they had heard, the one who sent sleeper agents to America, the one that Osama bin Laden had praised. Had they just solved, entirely by accident, one of the biggest mysteries of 9/11? Zubaydah, staring at the photograph, told the agents, "That's Mukhtar. How did you know that Mukhtar was the mastermind of September 11th? For years, Godin and other agents had considered KSM someone important, but not directly linked or critical to Al-Qaeda's core mission. His seeming insignificance meant there were just a small handful of people within the FBI and CIA who were even looking for him. But now, it seemed their second-tier target might actually be the architect of the worst terrorist attack in American history. The revelation sent shockwaves through the intelligence community. Every analyst and investigator wanted to know, who was this man they had so completely underestimated? KSM had lived in the shadows for months after 9/11. He had free rein to continue his operations undisturbed. Where he was, what he had planned, and how far his reach went was still unknown. KSM, in a way, was still a phantom to them. A phantom who could strike at any time, made worse by the fact that his intel file was much thinner than it should have been. They knew next to nothing about KSM. But if they had spent more time investigating, they would have seen the telltale signs of a dangerous terrorist being forged. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was born April 14, 1965, in Kuwait, the second youngest of 9 children in a Baluchi family that had immigrated from Pakistan. His father, Sheikh Mohammed Ali Dustin Baluchi, was a prayer leader known as an imam at a mosque in Al-Amadi, the administrative center of Kuwait's oil industry. The Mohammed family lived in Badawiya, a modest neighborhood caught between the desert and the sea. They were Bidun, short for Bidun Jinsiya, Arabic for without nationality. They were a stateless Arab minority, categorized as illegal residents, despite having no other country to call home. It was a fundamental fact of life that shaped young Khalid's worldview. They were permanent outsiders in the land of their birth. Khalid was a bright student, technically inclined, with a rebellious streak. He and his nephew, Abdul Basit Abdul Karim, once climbed their elementary school flagpole and tore down the Kuwaiti flag, an early sign of defiance. At 16, Khalid attended his first Muslim Brotherhood desert camp, where fiery speakers called young men to jihad. It was his first exposure to extremist ideology, but he wouldn't be here for long. When Khalid graduated from high school, his family chose to send him abroad for higher education. Khalid's culture shock upon arrival in North Carolina was overwhelming, forcing him to adapt to another society that wasn't welcoming. The local American boys would harass and bully Khalid and his fellow Arabs, calling them Abby Dabbies. What he witnessed in America appalled him. The drinking, the casual relationships, the materialism. It all confirmed his worst assumptions about Western decadence, the things that the Muslim Brotherhood had warned about. After graduating from North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University in 1986, with a Bachelor of Science degree in Mechanical Engineering, Khalid returned to Kuwait a changed man. Unable to find work, he headed to Peshawar, Pakistan, where his brothers had gone to support the jihad against Soviet forces occupying Afghanistan. He trained with them, learning military tactics and jihadist ideology. But after the Soviets withdrew in 1989, the various Afghan factions turned on each other, and in one of the battles, Khalid's brother was killed. That death shattered Khalid. His beloved brother, a religious scholar idolized in Qatar for his educational work, had died in a pointless battle. When Abdullah Azzam, the spiritual father of the jihad, was assassinated soon after, Khalid's faith in the cause cracked. Many of the Arab volunteers blamed America for abandoning them after the Soviets left. Khalid was one of them. A friend of KSM's nephews later recalled, "The hatred for Americans. It was among every Arab who came to Afghanistan. They all thought America had imposed its rule by vetoing Islamic rule in Afghanistan through its agents in Pakistan." In 1992, Khalid left for Qatar, where a member of the ruling family arranged for a job for him in the Ministry of Electricity and Water. But he hadn't given up the fight. He established a fundraising network throughout the Gulf, collecting donations from wealthy mosque goers to fund jihadist causes, including those dreamed up by his family members. KSM's nephew, Abdul Basit, had given himself a new name, Ramzi Youssef, and was looking to stage an attack in response to Palestinian Muslims being killed by Israeli forces. He reconnected with an old childhood friend, Abdul Hakim Murad, a Kuwaiti who had recently returned from the United States, where he had earned his commercial pilot's license. Youssef tried to convince Murad that they should attack the state of Israel, but Murad had a different idea, one that KSM could fund. Murad's experience in the US had led him to believe that the American funding of Israel was just as much of a problem. So if Youssef was looking for a target, Murad argued that the World Trade Center was ideal, as it was the workplace of many American Jews and a symbol of America. On February 26, 1993, Youssef's plan came to fruition. Murad constructed the bomb. Youssef had to execute the plot. When the truck bomb eventually exploded in the basement of the World Trade Center, it killed 6 people and wounded more than 1,000. That attack was funded, in part, by a $660 wire transfer from Khalid Sheikh in Doha. Uncle and nephew were now officially partners in terror, and their next plot would dwarf the World Trade Center bombing. In the summer of 1994, Khalid and Youssef, along with Youssef's friend Wali Khan Amin Shah, arrived in Manila, moving into neighboring hotels in Quezon City and setting themselves up as playboy businessmen. They frequented karaoke clubs in the Ermita district and dated local women. They discovered a dental clinic staffed with attractive female dentists, suddenly developing an unusual interest in getting their teeth cleaned regularly, behaviors that were very different from the strict, pious lives they led back home. But beneath the hedonistic facade, they were planning mass murder on an unprecedented scale. Their targets were a dozen American-flagged jumbo jets flying eastward across the Pacific. The plan, codenamed Bojinka, after a Serbo-Croatian word meaning big nose, called for 5 operatives to board different flights, assemble small explosive devices on board, set timers, then disembark at intermediate stops before the bombs detonated. If they were successful, it would kill thousands of passengers and crew members in a series of coordinated explosions over the Pacific Ocean. KSM and Youssef spent months perfecting their bomb design in the expensive, luxurious Tiffany condominium where they lived. The key ingredient was a readily available and inexpensive chemical in the Philippines, which could easily be disguised as contact lens solution. KSM emptied the contents of 14 contact lens solution bottles, making sure not to break the plastic seals, then refill them with the chemical. KSM planned to fly from Manila to Seoul, carrying 13 bottles in his carry-on bag, on a test run to see if their plan could work. He taped a small metal bolt beneath the arch of his bare foot to act as a dummy detonator, then wore jewelry and metal buttons to confuse the scanners, as well as keeping condoms in his bag. If anybody asked what he was doing, he was traveling to the Philippines to meet women. All he had to do was get through airport security. If he could do that, the plan was a go. The second KSM walked through the security scanner, the alarms went off. Security asked him to undress, including his shoes, but not his socks. However, he soon realized that he had made a big mistake. Inside his carry-on bag was a detailed plan listing all 12 of the targeted flights and the time the bombs would explode. Security officials had one question to ask him. Why did he have so much contact lens solution? I found a great sale in Manila. The customs officers never found the plan, and KSM provided rational answers to every question. They allowed him to fly to Seoul, but officials denied him entry due to a lack of a visa. Still, KSM had successfully proved that their plot would work. On December 11, 1994, the real test run was ready. Youssef boarded Philippine Airlines Flight 434 from Manila to Tokyo via Cebu, carrying a small version of their bomb. He assembled the device in the airplane toilet and placed it under the seat in front of him. An attendant noticed him changing seats throughout the flight, moving further and further from his original spot and jumping around the cabin. She had no idea he was trying to get out of range in case the bomb went off before it was supposed to. Yusuf got off in Cebu, and the bomb exploded exactly as planned during the second leg of the flight, blowing a hole in the fuselage and killing a Japanese businessman. Fortunately, the pilots managed to land the damaged aircraft at Okinawa's Naha airport. A slightly larger bomb would have brought down the entire plane. Satisfied with their test, KSM and Yusuf began final preparations for the main event, but it wouldn't come anytime soon. Yusuf, ever careless with explosives, mixed the bomb ingredients incorrectly and started a fire in the apartment. When firefighters responded, police discovered the condo filled with bomb-making materials, fake priests' robes for a planned assassination of the Pope, and a laptop computer containing the complete Bojinka plot. Yusuf escaped that night, but his accomplice, Abdul Hakim Murad, went back to retrieve the laptop. Authorities arrested him on the spot. The computer's hard drive contained a treasure trove of intelligence, flight schedules, target lists, and most significantly, references to Khalid Sheikh, the same name that had appeared on the wire transfer from the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. For the first time, investigators realized that the World Trade Center and Manila plots were connected. Frank Pellegrino, the former accountant turned FBI agent who was leading the Yusuf investigation, immediately grasped the significance of that information. His team had been tracking the mysterious Khalid Sheikh for 2 years without understanding his importance. Now they knew. He wasn't just Yusuf's uncle, he was a terrorist mastermind in his own right. But knowing and catching are two different things. In late 1995, after capturing Yusuf in Pakistan, investigators learned that KSM was still operating from his base in Doha, Qatar. The CIA and Qatari authorities prepared a joint operation to apprehend him. American officials had a rule for foreign affairs: do whatever you can to avoid embarrassing other governments. For Qatar, even the act of cooperating with America was an embarrassment for its conservative Islamist population. The Qatari government was modernizing the country, but it didn't want to do too much too soon. The White House and CIA wanted to stage a snatch and grab for KSM, catching him off guard and dragging him back to New York to face trial. However, the CIA didn't have the necessary assets in place, and nobody seemed to agree on how to pull it off. The only alternative the White House could agree on was to convince the Qataris to hand KSM over to the FBI. The negotiations lasted for days, with the Americans attempting to persuade the Qataris to understand the danger posed by KSM. But radical Islam, at this point, didn't seem like a significant threat to America. And, to the Qatari government, who knew much, much less than the FBI let on, KSM seemed totally insignificant. However, the Qataris did have one piece of information for the Americans. The individuals who were supposed to be monitoring KSM had lost track of him. Once again, KSM had vanished. To this day, nobody knows who exactly tipped off KSM. But that leak likely came from within the Qatari government, where KSM enjoyed protection thanks to Abdullah bin Khalid Al-Thani, a ruling family member who funded and employed former jihadists as a kind of personal interest. The Americans had spent so much time trying to avoid embarrassing the Qatari government that they missed their shot. KSM disappeared into the shadows, using dozens of aliases as he traveled between Afghanistan, Pakistan, and other jihadi-friendly locations, always out of reach of American intelligence. He was building something new, a loose network of terrorist cells that he could activate on demand. While KSM was evading them, the FBI and the CIA were once again locked in an ideological war. To the CIA, the FBI's approach was reactive. The Bureau's priority was finding evidence that could eventually lead to legal victories in the justice system. They were capturing suspects after crimes had occurred, but they weren't doing anything to stop terrorism beforehand. The CIA, on the other hand, had already established groups like the Counterterrorism Center to study and prevent terrorist threats proactively. They were analyzing every lead that came through as a potential threat. But the CIA employees were tired of that, too. Michael Shore was the chief of the Bin Laden station, the first, and at the time of this video only, CIA station ever dedicated to tracking a single individual. Based on their intelligence, the CIA and its groups had focused obsessively on Osama bin Laden, the face of Al-Qaeda, since the mid-90s. However, Shore, who was notoriously difficult to get along with, was constantly at odds with his bosses. The agency produced endless analysis, but took no actual action to prevent them from happening. In his eyes, they were just as ineffective as the FBI, maybe worse, since they were choosing not to act on these potential threats they analyzed. Shore desperately wanted responsibility for tracking KSM, believing that the agency was too incompetent to handle it themselves. He warned his superiors that KSM could get lost in the bureaucratic shuffle if they didn't focus. His fears were justified, but they were also prophetic. When the decision came down, Washington logic prevailed. In his words, so typically they chose the worst solution. They cut the baby in half. Shore got responsibility for bin Laden and Mohammed Jamal Khalifa, KSM's financier from the Philippines. Another analyst got assigned to KSM. I don't remember reading a single intel report from the field about where he was, what he was up to, or who he was with. Just as Shore predicted, KSM had fallen into a bureaucratic black hole. By 1996, the intelligence agencies, and Washington at large, had pushed aside the threat of international terrorism. With budgets shrinking and memories fading, the CIA, FBI, and the US government naively concluded that the 1993 World Trade Center attack was an isolated event. Even if they found KSM, they didn't believe there would be any payoff. KSM had been completely dismissed as a priority. Throughout the late 1990s, he remained active, but largely invisible to American intelligence. He moved freely through Malaysia, where he met with leaders of the regional militant organization Jama'ah Islamiyah, getting their support to build a Southeast Asian terror network. He worked for Islamic charities in Bosnia, even registered with local authorities under his real name. The CIA was monitoring these very organizations for terrorist connections, but somehow they missed KSM's involvement, even though he wasn't even trying to hide. On August 7, 1998, Al-Qaeda simultaneously detonated truck bombs outside the American embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and Tanzania, killing 224 people and wounding over 4,500. KSM had nothing to do with these attacks, but he was watching, and he was impressed. He had met bin Laden before in 1996, when the Al-Qaeda leader asked him to join the terrorist organization. But KSM just wanted to help with funding his ambitious dream, the biggest attack yet on the United States. KSM suggested that they train jihadi pilots in the United States, simultaneously hijack up to 10 planes from both coasts, and fly them all into buildings. Once their plan was completed, KSM would land the final plane in the middle of the United States, walk out onto the tarmac, and explain to the American public why this happened and what they should do to prevent it from happening again. Bin Laden promised he would think about it, but KSM didn't hear back. After seeing how devastating the embassy bombings had been, KSM sought a private audience with bin Laden himself. He still hadn't given up his plane hijacking idea, but now he was ready to join Al-Qaeda regardless. When KSM returned to Afghanistan in 1999, bin Laden was much more open to his idea. He still believed that the notion of hijacking airliners on both coasts simultaneously was too complicated, but the basic premise, using airliners as weapons against American targets, was something he liked. If they could streamline it to just 4 or 5 US planes, he would fund it. Bin Laden assigned 4 experienced jihadists to serve as pilots, 2 Saudis and 2 Yemenis. KSM took them under his wing, teaching them how to navigate America. The 2 Saudis already had their visas, but the Yemenis were denied. Not because of potential terrorist links, but because the US was rejecting applicants they believed were potential economic migrants. This was an unexpected problem for KSM. While he was handling that problem, 4 young men living in Hamburg, Germany, had arrived at bin Laden's training camps, seeking passage to Chechnya, hoping to fight on behalf of their Muslim brothers. These men had lived in the West for years, had no criminal record or suspicious nature, spoke languages other than Arabic, and wanted to do right by God. They were the perfect candidates for KSM's plot. All 4 men received physical training in the camps, were taught how to live in America, and were prepared for the greatest challenge of all, learning to fly a plane. The 4 men returned to Germany and immediately applied for American flight schools and US visas. The US approved 3 of them, but not the 4th, a Yemeni named Ramzi bin al-Shibh. Al-Shibh was known to be pretty lazy, rarely holding a job for more than a few weeks, but he was said to be surprisingly personable and charming to those around him. When his visa was rejected multiple times due to economic reasons, KSM asked al-Shibh to serve as the go-between for him and the hijackers, using coded email and chat room messages. That same month, an NSA satellite intercepted communications about an Al-Qaeda meeting in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. The CIA watched as suspected terrorists, including KSM's 2 Saudi pilots, gathered at a condominium overlooking a golf course. It was the intelligence breakthrough of a lifetime. The agency had identified 2 of the future 9/11 hijackers more than a year and a half before the attacks. On January 15, 2000, the 2 Saudis traveled under their own names from Bangkok to Los Angeles. At this point, the CIA now had an obligation to pass on the information to the more domestic-focused FBI, but they didn't. For some unknown reason, they never bothered to warn the Bureau that 2 likely terrorists had just arrived in the US. The 2 Saudis moved into the San Diego suburbs, renting a room in the home of a man who had previously acted as an FBI informant. But since the FBI knew nothing of the threat, and the informant didn't think there was anything strange about two young Arabs moving to the United States for the sole purpose of learning to fly planes, he never reported it to his contacts at the Bureau. The Saudis weren't hiding. They were living openly under their real names, preparing for martyrdom, knowing the U.S. would not think to look at them. By the summer of 2000, the plot was in motion. The Hamburg pilots arrived in the United States and enrolled in flight schools. KSM sent money through his nephew, Ali Abdul Aziz Ali, operating from Dubai. The operatives communicated through coded emails and innocent-sounding phone calls, but the warning signs were everywhere. Throughout 2001, the FBI received multiple warnings that it hadn't investigated. An FBI agent in Phoenix sent a memo about suspicious Middle Easterners at flight schools. A flight instructor in Minnesota reported that a French Moroccan, whom KSM had recruited as a backup pilot, was asking strange questions about flying, but not landing, planes. The dots were never connected. The FBI's criminal investigators didn't talk to the CIA's intelligence analysts, while field agents' reports disappeared into more bureaucratic black holes. Meanwhile, KSM had been struggling to find more operatives for his mission. For the past 2 years, he had been recruiting volunteers, many of whom couldn't get visas or backed out of the plot. He ended up with 19 hijackers. On the morning of September 11, 2001, those hijackers boarded 4 commercial airlines. Most of them were Saudi volunteers, with 3 being the Hamburg pilots trained and directed by KSM. And then they did the unthinkable. At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 struck the North Tower of the World Trade Center. 17 minutes later, United Airlines Flight 175 hit the South Tower. Within an hour, another plane hit the Pentagon, and Flight 93's hijacking was heroically foiled by those on board, sending the plane plummeting into a field instead of its intended target, the White House. The horrific attack KSM had been dreaming of since his college days in North Carolina was finally complete. 2 months later, U.S. military forces in Jalalabad raided a house, finding a videotape that would change everything. The video showed Osama bin Laden speaking with his associates, pointing to a figure out of frame who was referred to as Mukhtar, the chosen one. He praised Mukhtar as the mastermind of the attacks and thanked him profusely. It was the first time the intelligence communities had heard of any Al-Qaeda member being referred to by this name, a name that, in Arab countries, is commonly given to a highly revered leader of a community. This now meant that not only had the CIA and the FBI failed to prevent the attacks, but they were still completely unaware of the identity of potentially the most pivotal player in this whole plot. Meanwhile, 9/11 was just the beginning of a series of chaotic incidents secretly orchestrated by KSM, beginning with a failed shoe bombing and the abduction of a Wall Street Journal reporter investigating it. Authorities later received a video showing a masked KSM personally executing the reporter, a clear and direct threat. The intelligence community was bombarded with visuals of KSM's attacks from around the world, reminding them that he wasn't going to stop, and if they didn't stop him, he might return for a second wave attack against the U.S. While KSM was indulging in his murderous spree of destruction around the world, the FBI was struggling to handle the fallout of 9/11 and piece together what had happened. After the attacks, thousands of leads poured in every hour. Suspicious characters at flight schools, Middle Eastern men acting strangely, half-remembered conversations that suddenly seemed significant in hindsight. The FBI's terrorism investigators, accustomed to handling a few dozen cases at a time, were drowning in information, most of it false reports, and getting nowhere. One investigator recalled the struggle. "You were overwhelmed by it. We'd get an overnight cable about a bomb plot at 6 a.m. from NSA, and then by 8 a.m. it'd be processed and it'd be nothing." The ongoing bureaucratic warfare amplified the chaos. The CIA, stung by public criticism that it had failed to prevent 9/11, fought to maintain control over terrorism investigations abroad. The FBI insisted on its legal jurisdiction over crimes against Americans. Foreign intelligence services played their own games, sharing some information with the CIA while holding back other details at a moment that required full cooperation to prevent further bloodshed. Nowhere was this more problematic than in Pakistan, where many Al-Qaeda leaders had fled after the Taliban's collapse. Pakistani Inter-Services Intelligence, or the ISI for short, had long-standing ties to jihadist groups. Now the U.S. would be forced to work with an uncomfortable, possibly untrustworthy ally. CIA Station Chief Bob Grainer found himself managing the most complex intelligence operation in history. For over a year, he had received essentially no cooperation from the ISI, but 9/11 changed things. A proper partnership was absolutely necessary. American agents began working alongside Pakistani forces in midnight raids throughout the country, targeting potential al-Qaeda targets, but still, Chief Grainer was never 100% certain whether his local partners were allies or adversaries. The mistrust was mutual. Every raid was led by a single CIA agent, an FBI agent, if the CIA allowed it, and an ISI agent. But Pakistan demanded that only the Pakistani forces could enter the targeted homes, while the Americans had to wait outside. The Americans, already suspicious of the ISI's vested interest in jihadi groups, were obviously concerned. Despite enormous resources and manpower, the hunt for al-Qaeda's leadership seemed to produce only mid-level operatives and foot soldiers. The leadership was nowhere to be found. Zubaydah's capture in spring 2002 was the most significant achievement for the Americans. Keeping him alive was an even bigger miracle. But when he revealed KSM as the secret mastermind to the FBI, the CIA wasn't happy. President Bush had vowed that the CIA would be the lead agency in fighting al-Qaeda, and they had somehow missed out on the most significant piece of intel yet. They immediately sent new interrogators, CIA men, to take over, telling the FBI, "You will help the CIA. If they want you to, you provide questions. If they want you to do guard duty, you're going to do guard duty." The CIA interrogators dismissed the FBI's rapport-building method as too slow. They only wanted one piece of information: when would the next attack be? And to get it, they were prepared to use techniques that seemed less like interrogation and more like torture. It was a pattern that would repeat throughout the War on Terror. Strategic intelligence gathering sacrificed for rushed attempts to force information out of people through the applied use of pain and suffering, which often led nowhere. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, KSM was adapting to his new reality. He moved constantly through Karachi's sprawling slums, using the city's millions of inhabitants as human camouflage. He communicated through couriers and coded messages, always staying one step ahead of his pursuers. But he wasn't laying low. He was becoming increasingly brazen and unpredictable, taunting the U.S. authorities. On April 11, 2002, on the island of Jerba, Tunisia, KSM used his newly built terrorist network to pull off al-Qaeda's first successful mass attack since 9/11. A natural gas truck filled with explosives pulled up and detonated outside a synagogue, killing 21 people, most of them German nationals. The German government immediately launched into their own investigation, and the Americans were again reminded of how seemingly untouchable and unpredictable this Mukhtar was. They had to move fast if they were going to get him. The next breakthrough in the case came from an unexpected source, none other than KSM himself. Later that month, Yasri Fouda, a correspondent for Al Jazeera television, received a strange phone call. The mystery caller asked what he had planned for his show on the first anniversary of 9/11. 4 days later, Fouda received a proposal for a 3-part series on the attacks, with the full cooperation of al-Qaeda and an invitation to Islamabad for an exclusive interview with an unknown person of interest. Fouda agreed, but he couldn't have expected where it would take him. After weeks of negotiations conducted through intermediaries, Fouda found himself blindfolded in the backseat of a car driving through Karachi's crowded streets. His escort took him to a modest 4th-floor apartment where his blindfold was removed. 2 men were waiting in the apartment. One was tall and thin with a prominent beard. The other was short and stocky, wearing thick glasses. The short one asked him a simple question: "Recognize us yet?" They introduced themselves as Ramzi bin al-Shibh and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, KSM himself. They both claimed to be the masterminds behind the September 11th attacks. The CIA had known of bin al-Shibh, but, much like KSM in the early years, they apparently had no reason to believe he had a significant role in the attacks. For 2 days, KSM and bin al-Shibh gave Fouda the interview of a lifetime. KSM proclaimed himself the head of al-Qaeda's military committee and the leader of the 9/11 attacks, boasting the whole thing had been his idea. Bin al-Shibh introduced himself as KSM's deputy. They went into detail about how they planned and pulled off the attacks, even revealing the original plan for 9/11, crashing the planes into nuclear facilities. The only reason they changed course, in their words, was fear it would get out of control. You do not need to know more than that at this stage. And anyway, it was eventually decided to leave out nuclear targets. For now. When the interview was over, KSM walked him to the street to say goodbye, handing him a box. Inside was a will made by one of the 9/11 hijackers, a controversial document on what KSM called the New Crusades, and a video featuring a beheading of a Wall Street Journal reporter. KSM was relaxed, confident, even jovial, treating the interview as a kind of victory lap. Fouda couldn't believe how nonchalant and indifferent he was, even telling Fouda, "You would make the perfect terrorist. I mean, look at yourself. You are young, intelligent, highly educated, well organized. You speak good English, you live in London, and you are single. Fouda returned to London with a detailed account of KSM's role in the 9/11 attacks. When he briefed Al Jazeera's senior editors about the interview, they were so stunned that the station's chief immediately contacted Qatar's ruler, who passed the information to his friend, CIA Director George Tenet. Tenet informed his senior staff of the good news, telling them that his personal friend, the Emir of Qatar, had given the CIA an amazing gift. After 2 years of hunting, the CIA finally had a lead. The Al Jazeera interview confirmed KSM was based in Karachi and provided unprecedented first-hand insight into his role as the architect of 9/11. But it also revealed how comfortable he had become, how confident that American intelligence couldn't touch him. His arrogance was like a taunt to the West. Throughout 2002, with leads obtained through other investigations, Pakistani and American forces conducted a series of raids across Karachi, but they often led to empty apartments and no intel. The Americans were growing increasingly frustrated. Every failed raid just gave KSM more time to plan his next attack. In fact, Karachi was considered a very challenging city to find hidden terrorists. It had a reputation for kidnapping and murder, and Karachi's overbuilt real estate market provided endless hiding places for those with cash and connections. In August 2002, the FBI arrested Abdul Samad Din Muhammad, a brother-in-law of KSM. He told them that Ali Abdul Aziz Ali was in constant contact with his uncle, KSM, that he had a continuous stream of Arab visitors from Pakistan at the airport, and that he had been in an inexplicable rush to leave the UAE days before the 9/11 attacks. FBI agent Jennifer Keenan figured that the best way to reach KSM might be through his nephew. Ali had served as the 9/11 pilot's financier, transferring hundreds of thousands of dollars to the hijackers in the United States. The FBI had obtained intel that Ali was operating out of Karachi. This was their chance. Agent Keenan took the information directly to the CIA's lead officer in Karachi, hoping to establish an alliance, interrupt the financial supply, and track it straight to its commanders, including KSM. But the CIA supervisors had never heard of Ali. No matter how much she tried to explain his significance, she couldn't convince the CIA to investigate. "We hunt terrorists, not financiers." The CIA ended the conversation on the spot. In September 2002, neighbors complained about excessive traffic to a house in Karachi's Gulshani Iqbal neighborhood, prompting a raid by Pakistani forces. They captured a Saudi man leaving the house, Mohammed Ahmed Rabbani. While he resisted speaking, his driver proved surprisingly talkative, claiming Rabbani and his brother managed several safe houses used by Arab fighters. He provided addresses for other safe houses, including one on Tariq Road, where authorities found Rabbani's brother, along with 2 men, 2 women, and 3 children, as well as 20 carefully wrapped passports and almost 24 Sega game consoles that someone had converted into detonators for bombs. The passports were for members of Osama bin Laden's family, none of whom were inside the home. 2 of the children said that their father's name was actually Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. Nobody within the house knew where KSM was, but they were aware of large groups of Arab men at an upscale part of the city, and that they were well armed and cautious. The authorities believed one guest house in particular may have contained KSM. The target house in question had been rented out 2 months earlier, with the men inside coming one by one over a period of 2 weeks, carefully evading detection. They hadn't left for a month, having food, weapons, and supplies brought to them. The ISI contacted the Americans, immediately organizing an operation for the next morning, a rare sign of trust between the 2 countries. When the FBI agents arrived, they were instructed to sit tight while the Pakistanis babysat the house. After dawn, the ISI managed to intercept the caretaker on his way back from morning prayers. He told the authorities that the entire top floor was filled with Arabs who had overpaid on the rent and lived there for 2 months straight. When the sun rose, the soldiers stormed the building, engaging in a brutal gun and grenade fight for hours. 2 gunmen were killed, while 3 policemen and 2 intelligence agents were injured, but they had secured the building. They searched every room, one by one, but found no sign of KSM or any other notable target. Then, in a storage space, hidden under a stairwell, they found him, Ramzi bin al-Shibh, the man who weeks earlier had declared himself the deputy of the September 11th attacks. He and another man were holding knives to their throats, vowing to die rather than talk. The Pakistani agents wrestled the weapons away, securing the 2 men. The raid that netted bin al-Shibh also produced a treasure trove of intelligence, computers, phones, documents, and several other suspected terrorists. but questioning al-Shibh proved pointless. The CIA soon discovered that his role was simply relaying instructions back and forth. His self-proclaimed role as deputy was completely insignificant. KSM was the sole mastermind, and he was still nowhere to be found. The agents had asked just about everybody they encountered for the address of KSM's latest safe house. They obtained an address from almost everybody they asked, but never the same one. If the intel could be trusted, it meant he was constantly on the move, never staying in one place for long. While the Americans struggled to track him down, KSM was free to orchestrate his biggest international attack since 9/11. On October 12, 2002, at approximately 11:05 p.m. in Bali, Indonesia, a bomber detonated an explosive vest inside Paddy's Irish Bar, a popular spot for tourists. As the terrified crowd fled outside, they ran right into the blast of another, much bigger car bomb. 202 people from 21 countries were killed in the incident, including 7 Americans. No intelligence agency in the world was prepared for the Bali bombings. The attack had completely evaded not only the US agencies, but also the British and Australian ones. While the CIA agents were determined to continue chasing the ghost that was KSM, the FBI was employing other, more forensic methods to close in on their suspect. Jennifer Keenan and her team were scouring the vast amounts of evidence that they had collected from the previous raids: cell phones, computers, and notepads. While the CIA had dismissed the idea of pursuing the money trail, Keenan and her team were actively working on it. Dennis Lermel, the FBI's financial crimes expert, had assembled a team of forensic accountants to trace Al-Qaeda's funding sources. However, even he was hindered by mismanagement from the top. Whenever a new lead or question surfaced, the FBI assigned one of Lermel's investigators to handle it, removing another member from his team. However, there was no strategic plan in place for any of the investigators, so he wrote one. Lermel believed that his team should focus entirely on the money trail, following it from start to finish. Within a week, they traced wire transfers, credit card purchases, and cash movements across multiple countries, tracing the transactions from the 9/11 hijackers' bank accounts to the UAE, where KSM had sent his nephew, Ali Abdul Aziz Ali, and an associate to handle the money. They were wiring funds to the hijackers from local exchange centers that required no identification. The investigation provided some insight into KSM's methods. He rarely used banks, preferring informal money transfer systems like Hawala that left minimal paper trails. When he did use formal financial institutions, it was through associates and cutouts who often didn't know their actual client's identity. By early 2003, the net was closing. American and Pakistani forces had mapped much of KSM's network, identified his key facilitators, and established patterns in his movements. They had also gained what intelligence professionals call tactical leverage, enough captured associates to make KSM's position increasingly precarious. But then they had one final, surprising informant, a walk-in who came to Pakistani authorities with detailed information about KSM's location. The informant's identity remains classified, but we do know he was someone who had direct access to KSM's inner circle. Some reports suggest he was motivated by the $25 million bounty on KSM's head. Others indicate he was a Pakistani intelligence asset who had been cultivating access to Al-Qaeda's high-ranking operatives for months. Whatever his motivation, the CIA had been working with the informant for over a year. He had been vetted, passed polygraph tests, and had consistently delivered on the intel that the CIA wanted. But now, he had the most crucial task of all, to reconnect with KSM. For months, he had tried to meet with KSM in person, but that proved impossible. The CIA had to find an alternative plan. They would lure KSM to him. The agency fed information, which is still classified to this day, to the informant, who then passed it on to KSM, who agreed to meet with him in Rawalpindi on February 28th. Unlike the massive operation that had captured Abu Zubaydah, this would be small and surgical. Too many people were aware of the intelligence failures of the previous 2 years. There could be no leaks and no last-minute escapes for KSM. The CIA put together a team made up almost exclusively of its own agents and a few ISI members who were deliberately not told who the target was. The CIA, unsurprisingly, excluded the FBI. That night, in Rawalpindi, KSM arrived at his safe house at around 9 p.m. The informant was brought to the home not long after. They spoke for an hour about the intel that the informant claimed to have, but KSM had made a big mistake. Despite being paranoid and vigilant about cell phones in his space, he had, for some reason, allowed the informant to bring his phone into the house. When he slipped into the bathroom, the informant sent a text to his Pakistani CIA handlers, "I am with KSM." When they reached the site, the CIA rushed the informant off to the Islamabad airport with plans to put him on a plane and fly him out of the country before KSM even knew what was happening. Meanwhile, the American and Pakistani forces took their positions outside the safe house and waited in the dark until they were certain that KSM, who was known to be a night owl, would be asleep. At 2 a.m. local time, the Pakistani forces broke through the gate and the front doors, then herded his family into a back room. When they reached his room, KSM was, surprisingly, still asleep in his pajamas. When he woke up, he was so groggy from his sleeping pills that he offered to compensate the Pakistani soldiers if they let him go free. "Why are you doing this for the Americans? If it's money, I'll give you what you want." CIA Director George Tenet was at Camp David for a series of weekend meetings with President Bush and other advisors. He had been asleep when the attack took place, but woke up to the sound of the ringing telephone. It was good news. Their agents had successfully taken KSM into custody without firing a single shot. The man who had orchestrated 9/11, the abduction and murder of an American journalist, an attack on a Tunisian synagogue, the Bali bombings, and multiple other foiled plots, was finally caught. The soldiers had caused so much noise breaking in that they woke the neighbors, and by morning, the scene was swarming with cameras and local media. By that afternoon, the Pakistani press reported that KSM had been captured, but the story was already evolving into myth. Pakistani officials, eager to claim credit for the operation, told local media that KSM had engaged in a fierce gun battle before surrendering. They said that he boldly wrestled with his pursuers, grabbed the rifle of an ISI agent, and shot one of the soldiers in the foot before being subdued. Meanwhile, KSM was on a CIA aircraft bound for a black site in Poland, beginning what would become the most extensive interrogation in the history of the War on Terror. While KSM's capture was making news around the world, the CIA was still looking to control the narrative. They had been concerned that Pakistani press coverage was covering the story with photos that made KSM appear handsome. Even their own CIA photos, taken after capture, in their eyes, didn't look attractive enough. An agent had to mess up KSM's hair and take another picture to make him look unpresentable enough to share with the world for the first time. The US and Pakistani media were proudly hailing this as a critical victory in the war against terror. But in a way, the US had already lost. Almost 3,000 people had been killed on September 11th. Had the FBI and CIA worked together, cooperated on operations and leads, and shared the intel they were receiving, it's possible that 9/11 and all of KSM's other attacks could have been prevented. KSM succeeded in his heinous crimes in part because of the disorganization, lack of communication, and debilitating pride at the top levels of the intelligence community. But his streak of terror was finally over, and his reckoning was just beginning. For the next 3 years, KSM was held at a series of CIA black sites in Poland, Romania, Lithuania, and other European countries. CIA interrogators subjected him to what they sugarcoated as enhanced interrogation techniques, a code word for waterboarding, stress positions, sleep deprivation, and psychological manipulation. According to CIA records, agents waterboarded KSM 183 times. The technique, which simulates drowning, was designed to break down his resistance and force him to reveal Al-Qaeda's secrets. Whether it is ever justified or even effective as an interrogation tool remains a matter of fierce debate. KSM eventually provided information about planned attacks and Al-Qaeda's structure, but he also made false confessions and led investigators down numerous dead ends. In March 2007, after 3.5 years in CIA custody, officials transferred KSM to the military detention facility at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. There, he faced a combatant status review tribunal, a military panel tasked with determining whether he qualified as an enemy combatant. KSM's appearance before the tribunal was his first public statement since his capture. The transcript, later released but heavily redacted by military censors, revealed a man who had transformed captivity into a piece of theater, thrilled and gleeful that the US authorities had been chasing his lies around the world while he knew the truth. I was responsible for the 9/11 operation from A to Z. He then proceeded to claim responsibility for 31 terrorist plots and attacks, ranging from the 1993 World Trade Center bombing to the planned but foiled assassination of Pope John Paul II. Some of his confessions were clearly accurate. Others seemed designed to inflate his importance or mislead investigators. Legal experts noted that the extreme interrogation he had endured made it virtually impossible to separate truth from fiction in his statements. The confession, nonetheless, provided unprecedented insight into Al-Qaeda's operations and KSM's role as its chief operational planner. It confirmed what investigators had, eventually, suspected, that he was far more critical to the organization than Osama bin Laden himself. In February 2008, a military commission at Guantanamo formally charged KSM and 4 co-conspirators with war crimes. The charges carried the death penalty, but the case quickly became mired in legal challenges over the admissibility of evidence obtained through torture. Pre-trial hearings dragged on for more than a decade, becoming a symbol of everything that had gone wrong with America's approach to terrorism prosecutions. Multiple trial dates were set and postponed, with defense attorneys arguing that the CIA had so brutally tortured their client that he could not receive a fair trial. That legal stalemate continued through 3 presidential administrations. In July 2024, military prosecutors reached a plea agreement with KSM and 2 co-defendants. They would plead guilty to conspiracy and murder charges in exchange for life sentences, avoiding the death penalty. But Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin revoked it just 2 days after its announcement, insisting that the 9/11 case should go to trial, giving victims' families and the American public their day in court. Over the next year, that decision was overturned and reinstated, leaving the case in a state of legal limbo. As of now, nearly 22 years after his capture and 24 years after 9/11, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed remains at Guantanamo Bay, his case unresolved as of this video. Ultimately, KSM's victories are not limited to the horrors of 9/11 and every other crime against humanity that he has committed. It was also everything after. His case has exposed the cracks in America's justice system and bureaucratic investigative agencies. The CIA and the FBI exist with the same goal: to protect American citizens from threats, domestically and abroad. Yet, their repeated inability to work together while hunting those responsible for some of the biggest terrorist attacks in history may have allowed thousands of innocent lives to be lost. In 2002, the National Commission on Terrorist Attacks upon the United States was formed to investigate this breakdown between agencies. They released a report 2 years later. In the public statement, it read, "We recognize that we have the benefit of hindsight, and since the plotters were flexible and resourceful, we cannot know whether any single step or series of steps would have defeated them. What we can say with confidence is that none of the measures adopted by the U.S. government before 9/11 disturbed or even delayed the progress of the Al-Qaeda plot. This was a failure of policy, management, capability, and, above all, a failure of imagination." Thank you for watching. If you would like to show appreciation to the people whose hard work made this video possible, then consider hitting the like button and subscribing to our channel. It's the best thing you can do to help us make more videos, like this one, about the FBI's race against time to hunt down the New York City car bomber before he could destroy countless innocent lives. Click the video on your screen now to hear the full story.